Okay, aloha mai kako, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Next Steps Law for Librarians Field Guide. And before we get started, I just want to mention a couple of our upcoming events. One on May the 28th, we will be hearing from Sarah Soor and Cindy Texera at Windward Community College about how they have begun to decolonize the library at WCC. And on May 30th, HLA is having its spring meeting, so I hope that you will all be able to join us for that. And the information about the spring meeting is already on the HLA website, and we'll be sending out information about the May 28th Next Steps program when we get to May. So today, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Jane Gagne, who has been working in libraries for over 10 years, and she has held a number of different positions, but she also has gotten a master's in education, so she's focusing more on creating engaging learning experiences for library staff and the community. And she is joined by Brian Huffman, who is the Electronic Services Librarian at the William S. Richardson School of Law Library. And he has his JD from Drake University and his MLIS from St. Catherine University, and he's been at the law library for a number of years. So please join me in welcoming Jane and Brian, and take it away.
Hello, my name is Jane. I'm very excited to have Brian here to help. He helps consult on a lot of this presentation because I've been in Virginia up until last July, so a lot of my regional information was for the Southeast, and I was really excited to have Brian help with the Hawaii side of things because I'm still very new here and learning my way around. Um, I've been a Law for Librarians trainer for about 2 years. I'm also the peer coach for Region 3, and I've been serving on the Association of Rural and Small Libraries Advocacy Committee, as well as the Virginia Library Association Intellectual Freedom Forum. Actually, let me go back to this page for a second. There is a QR code on this page to download the presentation. If you would like a copy of that, I will also have this QR code again at the end of the presentation. So if you're not in a position to download it now, there are hyperlinks in this presentation, which is obviously very silly for a live presentation or even a video recorded one, which is why I have the download one. So this can kind of be like a portable toolkit for you to do some further research if you'd like. So, the boring part, legal disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not able to practice law. This is not legal advice. This is just legal information. So, please don't take this presentation in lieu of consulting an actual lawyer who is legally able to practice law in your location. So, Law for Librarians, a little bit about that is basically the idea was to train a bunch of library workers so that they could go out and train more library workers. So, it was a train the trainer event. It started in 2024, and they just trained a new cohort this past fall. And the idea is to keep bringing in new trainers and kind of growing that cohort of folks who can train library workers so that this information gets sent around and lots of people know what they need to know. Okay, so a quick check-in if you guys are willing to type into chat. I'd like to know how you feel about the law. Does it make you feel happy, scared, nervous? You don't know enough about it, or you know everything about it, or it's super boring. I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts, like what your baseline is going into this presentation. I like that one. Thank God for law librarians. Definitely true. Yeah, I feel that I don't know enough. I'm a surface level knowledge about the law. I'm not a legal expert. I've just been trained on a few concepts. And the more I know, the more I realize that I have to learn still. Thank you. Excellent responses. Thank you, everybody. All right, so the law can be kind of mystifying, but hopefully we will demystify some of that for you today. This slide is here because I feel like the question I get the most is, I need a lawyer, how do I find one? And you can check out legal resources for the public from UH Manoa Law Library. You can also type generic legal questions into Hawaii's Legal Navigator, which is a pretty neat resource. That's not going to talk to an actual person. It's basically going to search the resources they have available, but sometimes that's a good place to start. Hawaii State Law Library System has info for self-represented litigants, which is if you're interested in representing yourself in a legal setting, that's really helpful. Even if you're just going to defend yourself for a parking ticket, that can be really useful. And then online access to Hawaii State primary legal materials. And then in our presentation, we're going to talk about some really, really basic US law basics, information about kind of the big four that I feel like I see a lot of in libraries or questions that come out of libraries. So copyright, First Amendment, privacy, and freedom of information. And then we'll review some best practices. We'll have additional resources, and then we will have time for questions as well. And because fortunately we have Brian to help answer them, so I want to take advantage of that. So laws come from a few different places. They come from constitutions. So that could be your state constitution, the Constitution of the United States, statutes and codes, case law. So this is when a case has gone to court and a judge has ruled on it, and then that kind of establishes this thing called precedent or case law, and other lawyers can refer back to other cases that have been ruled in a certain way. And then administrative rule or regulation. So this can be a lot of your alphabet soup organizations like the FBI, CIA. And then there's a couple things that have to be in place before a court can decide a case. There has to be an actual dispute. The plaintiff or party has to have standing. So that means they have to have suffered some sort of legal harm. The court has to have the authority over the people involved. So personal jurisdiction, the court has to have over the authority over the subject. So that's going to be your subject matter jurisdiction, and they have to have authority to decide cases where the case is located. So if someone from California and someone wants to try their court in the state of Utah, there has to be an actual reason that Utah is being involved. They can't just go there because they wanted to visit Utah to have their case tried. And then this is also kind of where our like the issues with something being unconstitutional. When something happens and it's unconstitutional, it doesn't really trigger anything automatically. Someone has to challenge that situation as being unconstitutional. So they have to have been harmed. Their rights, their constitutional rights have to have been harmed, and they have to bring that to court, which is why it's like, oh, that's unconstitutional. How can they do that? Well, they can't, but they can't until somebody goes and challenges it and it goes to court, and that can take some time. So the court system of the United States, it's all kind of escalating. Same with the state courts and the federal courts. You start out in the smaller courts, you work your way up through appeals, and then you may or may not get seen by the highest court. So, for example, the US Supreme Court can choose whether or not to hear cases. So, all the cases that get put before the US Supreme Court don't get heard. I don't think they would have time to hear them all. That would be a ridiculous number of cases. Sometimes they explain why they'll take a case, and sometimes they don't have an explanation. And but they do have the ability to just not hear a request. And then don't forget about your state laws. So each state has its own state laws, which can be confusing because you'll hear someone in one state talking about something and it's different in the state that you live in. So I've linked here the government portal, hawaii.gov. They've got information about Hawaii's legislature and agencies. And also AALL has state-specific resources. This is the link to their state-specific privacy laws. And then I never underestimate the power of your law library. So Hawaii's state law library system has a lot of amazing resources in there. Please take a look, search around, see what's available to you. This is just a little snapshot of information that is available through that page. There's information on, and there's various subject guides, which is really helpful, especially if you're training staff or coworkers. And also, this information is great for patrons too, because they'll come in and they might say, I'm struggling with disaster recovery. What are my legal avenues? And there's a subject matter guide in the state law library. All right, so copyright law. This is all in Title 17 of the US Code. It's a federal code that protects copyright material. Copyright is basically intellectual property. Um, it's really interesting because we are all protected by copyright. So if you have ever written an academic work or an article or drawn a picture or uh, posted a poem anywhere, that is your intellectual material. So copyright does protect you. And then ALA also intersects with copyright because the Code of Ethics states that we respect intellectual property rights and advocate balance between the interests of information users and rights holders. And so it can kind of seem that libraries might be at odds with copyright because our goal is to get information out to the public, to share information as widely as possible. But what libraries do is they work in this really neat intersection between the economic purpose of copyright, because libraries are big purchasers of copyright material, licenses, digital licenses now, especially with the rise of ebooks, and also the public benefit purpose of copyright, which is giving people access to materials that they might not regularly have access to. I've linked here the Columbia University Copyright Basics. I felt like that had a really nice guide for what copyright basics are. And then I want to talk a little bit about Section 108, because this is Section 108 of the federal statutes, and it basically applies directly to libraries and education providers, because libraries and archives. So this is just like a little checklist. It talks about what makes something fair use versus not fair use. A lot of folks post that little disclaimer on their YouTube video that says something about under fair use, blah, 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 blah. That disclaimer doesn't really do anything legally for the folks posting that video. Um, Technically, the owners of that material could still bring a lawsuit against those folks, but and then it would be tested in court based on kind of what is and isn't fair use. So are they really submitting a fair use work? It there's a lot of misconceptions around this. I think there's some myth about if it's less than 15 seconds or something like that, then you can't get in trouble or something along those lines. So it's really important to kind of inform yourself and your patrons if they're asking you what fair use is and kind of what the parameters are around that. And then this one is the Section 108. So the first test is, are you a library or an archive? The second test is, are you trying to preserve something? Do you have the only copy of something? Are you trying to share it for academic purposes? And then Section 108 is also what protects interlibrary loans. So I don't know if you have interlibrary loans at your institution, but if you do, then that might be really important for you. And also, this has become really, really important, especially post-COVID, because a lot of libraries shut down and they needed to get their resources to people in a virtual way. And it's also really important in Hawaii because I was just at uh, UH Manoa and I was in the library there, and they have a lot of materials there that are only located there in that one place. And if somebody is researching something and the only document is available at one archive in Hawaii and they live in Alabama and they're a Port College student, they're probably not going to be able to fly to Hawaii to be able to read that one article that has a sole copy in the archives of one library. So 108 allows for some flexibility in how we get that information to someone so that they're able to actually access the information that they need without having to fudge any copyright laws because of the protections under 108. And then also there's an interesting subsection in here about the last 20 years. If a work is in the last 20 years of its copyright, libraries actually have more freedom to share that item. And copyright life right now, if you were to copyright something, it's life of the author plus 70 years, although that's changed throughout the decades. So for, I think in the 1970s, prior to the 1970s, it was life of the author plus 50 years. I think in 1918, it was like 25 years plus a 25-year extension. And then there's some other changes that occurred. So that's why a lot of things that were published before 1920 are in the public domain because it was a much shorter copyright period. So the big one that gets brought up a lot in conjunction with libraries is the First Amendment. And one of the things I really like about the First Amendment is it's it's quite short. Um, so Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So I put this stuff in bold that I feel like comes up a lot in conjunction with libraries. But also, I really just wanted to point out that this is the First Amendment, and there's no mention here of libraries or books. So that information comes from interpretation of the First Amendment that has been interpreted through case law, through the Supreme Court over the decades and decades and decades since the First Amendment came into existence. So it applies to states through the 14th Amendment. It applies to adults as well as minors. This is something I actually learned. Is I was like, oh, I don't know why I hadn't really thought about it, but before you turn 18, you still have First Amendment rights, which is why students have been able to successfully bring cases against their schools for having their First Amendment rights impugned. And that can be like the right to assemble, the right to access information. Um, but the important thing for libraries is the First Amendment protects the right to speak and the right to receive information. So libraries are one of the big conduits where folks receive information. So that's how people get a lot of that information that they have a constitutional right to receive. It applies to government entities, not private entities. It applies to all speech unless it's designated unprotected. So unprotected categories of speech are like hate speech, fighting words, things like that, threats. And then it's relevant to traditional public forums and designated or limited public forums. And honestly, you may not know what a public forum is, and that's okay. But a public forum are those places where you have a right to peaceably assemble. And it's interesting what makes something a public forum and not. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, actually. So book challenges are on the rise. There's a lot of legislation limiting the freedom to read on the rise as well. Not necessarily in, I think Hawaii is actually the opposite. I was tracking a bill that's supposed to actually protect the freedom to read, but in some states there's more adverse legislation coming out. There have been some circuit court cases that have challenged freedom to read. So the Delano v. Little case in I believe it's the Fifth Circuit Court, which is like Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas. That case has created some problematic case law that frustrates some folks. So, and I think the interesting thing too is there's a lot of large scale non-local organizations that are organizing targeted campaigns, and they kind of have really advanced technology that's basically scanning the web for things that they don't agree with. And so if you're ever thinking, oh, well, my community is really supportive, we might not ever have a book challenge here, keep in mind that there's a lot of groups that are looking to kind of expand their reach into places that are harder to reach. And it might not be your community at all that is bringing those frustrating situations. So it's still really important to stay informed and research all of the various resources available to you. I have linked here the ALA Adverse Legislation Tracker. This is, you can check which legislation is going on state by state. ALA has a selection and reconsideration policy toolkit. So basically, this is if you're looking to update your selection and reconsideration policies, this can be a helpful guide. Central Kansas Library System has a really nice intellectual freedom guide. And then if you are facing any challenges, even if it's, I had someone recently, it was just like a single book that was taken from their school library. They still submitted it to the ALA challenge reporting tool. There was another one that was submitted that you wouldn't think would be traditionally, but they worked in a university and their bosses wanted to pull patron records in a way that hadn't been previously approved by those patrons who submitted that information. So they felt like that was going to be an unfair use of personal information. And so they submitted it on the ALA challenge reporting tool. It just helps get resources in the right place. So public forums, I brought this up briefly previously, but libraries or parts of a library can be considered a designated or limited public forum, where this might not be the case if you work for a private institution, right? Because that's not a government body. But library, once you allow people in, then you should be able to allow all people in. And now you can have some things in your policy that maybe don't, that maybe limit that, like everybody's welcome here, but you have to have shoes because that's a safety concern. It has to be limited in your policy and it has to be viewpoint neutral. So that's a big thing. And then the interesting thing about forums is meeting spaces can be public forums or limited public forums. And that can open up situations where if you're allowing community members to reserve your meeting space, that means any community member can reserve your meeting space. So some libraries have run into situations where um, maybe someone from a very race-based organization is trying to use your space to hold meetings, or maybe you have a church reserving your space every Sunday and they're worshiping very loudly, that sort of thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if they're disrupting library staff, then that can be a problem, or library users. So you need to have that in your policy is who is allowed to use your meeting spaces. It has to be viewpoint neutral. It has to be based in your policy and practice. Something else that I thought was really interesting is display cases can also be considered public forums. So if you're allowing the community to reserve your display cases and put up their own designs, then that has then become a public forum. So pretty much any organization could then request space in a display case. So what you want to do is you want to keep your display cases as something that is library controlled. You can partner with community organizations, but you don't want to leave it open for community organizations to reserve at their own leisure, because you want to keep that as not a public forum. And then another thing is First Amendment audits. I don't know if anybody here has had experience with them. I've experienced them firsthand. It's typically when someone comes in and they're videotaping things that are happening in a government office, and that includes libraries. And usually it's for YouTube content. They're really hoping to get a rise out of somebody. And but I mean, people are just going about their daily lives. But they do have a right typically to be there and filming as long as they are not violating any of the library policies. So if they're not harassing community members, if they are staying in publicly designated areas, and that's where it's really important to mark your staff only areas, because if it's not clearly marked, then someone could potentially go in there and film in there, and you don't want that. But the big thing about First Amendment audits is just train your staff, remain calm, let them come in. The best thing to do is just be as boring as possible, because if you're not giving them content for the YouTube channel, they're going to go somewhere else. All right, again, best practices, clearly mark your private and staff only areas, and then please have clear policies in place and make sure your policies are viewpoint neutral. So We want libraries to be accessible to everyone, regardless of their viewpoint, and make sure that's really clear in your policies. There was a fun game that was just released back in February. It's Imagine If by Library Futures. It's a gamified version of a presentation ALA President Sam Helmick was giving, but it's basically a choose your own adventure style game. And it's neat because you get to go back and choose different routes, and you're actually encouraged to choose, they call it choose chaos, but choose like what you think the wrong answers are and see what the potential outcomes. Because I threw this in here because this doesn't have to be dry or boring or unapproachable. There are a lot of great resources out there and a lot of great training resources, so you can get those out to your staff if they need them. But let's choose some chaos in a nice, safe cartoon online setting. All right. So privacy law is another big one. Only when an individual is assured that his choice of reading material does not subject him to criticism, reprisals, or punishments can the individual fully enjoy their freedom to express ideas, weigh arguments, and decide for themselves what they believe. So, this is a quote from Deborah Caldwell Stone. She's recently retired, but she was the executive director at the Office of Intellectual Freedom. Privacy is integral to freedom, and I really like the way that quote kind of explained that. Is if you don't have privacy, then you're not actually free to consume all the things you want to consume because you might not feel safe if somebody knew every book you've ever read or every article you've ever looked up or everything you've typed into Google. Uh, that's a very big window. And so privacy has been interpreted by the Supreme Court in the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments. So basically, through case law, they've interpreted that those amendments protect aspects of privacy. It's also protected by constitutional provisions, state and federal statutes and regulations, and other more specific instances. So it could be person specific or industry specific. So that's like HIPAA, your health privacy protections. And then Hawaii has a library specific privacy protection, which is the for circulation records of library patrons. So that information is by law supposed to remain private, although it's okay if you need that information in order to assess them fines for late fees. Okay, so some privacy best practices. If you are able to do this, if it's within your power, let library users know how and when their data will be collected. And this actually gets a little complicated when you think about the vendors your library uses. So like you have people sign up for Libby. Do you know what Libby's privacy practices are? There was a big controversy that happened last year with Hoopla, another vendor, and what they were doing with their privacy protections. If at all possible, please anonymize any data you gather, because if someone comes to your library with a a warrant for all of the teens who have attended your teen programming, if you don't have their names, you can't give them that information. Um, So sometimes it's easier not to collect that personal information in the first place. Yes, we need statistics in order to support our programs, but do you really need to know someone's name and phone number and that they came to your program? Or um, if you can't anonymize the data, can you have a really
Oh, Jane, your audio just went out.
Oh, my internet connection is unstable.
I can hear you now.
Let me see if I can turn my video back on. All right. We'll see what we get away with. Um, if at all possible, get folks permission before posting their photos. It's possible somebody might not want their photo posted in conjunction with attending an LGBT game night or something like that. Just some folks value their privacy in different ways, so try to be mindful of that. Train your library staff in how to respond to things like warrants, subpoenas, freedom of information requests. Although in Hawaii it's UIPA, and other government requests for personal information. Consult the National Information Standards Organization privacy principles. They have some good guidelines. Conduct regular assessments to maintain privacy standards. Consider whether users have to reveal personal information for accessing a resource. And consider vetting vendor contracts if you have the ability, and keep your IT departments informed of their ethical responsibilities. So let's protect some privacy, folks. So Freedom of Information Act, I did just kind of talk about that briefly, but FOIA, the way most folks talks about it, is specifically applies to the federal government. Municipal and state freedom of information laws vary state to state, and they're often called something else. So in Hawaii, it's the Uniform Information Practices Act. You submit those through the Office of Information Practices, but it's a similar idea to FOIA for the federal government. Basically, someone can request records that have to do with government practices. So in the area where I just left, someone actually had a standing FOIA request for all of the financial documents relating to the um my brain just stopped working. The like all of the financial documents relating to the entire city government because they worked at the newspaper, and even though there were some financial implications, they were able to kind of keep that rolling. So they always got all of the financial documents. Records, basically, folks can request government records. And what is a government record? You guys, some of you work in archives. Lots of different things can be records, but usually when someone is requesting a record, it's usually emails related to it, or financial documents, spreadsheets, things like that. And those records typically shouldn't include personal devices and personal emails unless you've been using those personal devices and emails in your official capacity as a public agency employee. So that's why you should be really mindful of what you're using your work email for. If you're using your work email to do things that you don't want someone to be able to request records of, then you should be using your private email and not your work email. And if you ever have any questions about FOIA or you're being subjected to any sort of records request, you can and should always consult your own legal counsel because it's good to have an expert on hand to make sure all of the correct things are being done. Okay, so reviewing best practices, you should absolutely have strong policies. The best offense is a good defense. Sorry, my sports metaphors almost got mixed up there for a second, but have strong policies in place. If you're not in charge of writing the policies for your institution, maybe talk to the people who are in charge and see if they're willing to review it. You can always come to them with things you've learned and been like, oh, I learned all these things. Is there any way we could apply this to our policies? Um, Big things to review are your records management policies, your behavior policies, your meeting room policies, and your privacy policies, because those come up, I feel like, the most. Um, Train your staff, train yourself. You can also train the public. You can have information available for the public to learn about these things and their rights as well. Where possible, consult legal counsel. This can get really specific. Ideally, you should be consulting someone familiar with your municipal, federal, and state requirements. And then just clearly mark staff only in private areas. Just it saves you so much headache in the long run. And this is just an easy thing to do. You just print out a sign, you put it on the door, and then you're done. So it's easy, low effort, um, I highly recommend. But then it's amazing how we don't think about it because we're in those spaces every day and we're familiar with them and we don't think what somebody coming in might see when they look at those spaces. Okay. I know that was a lot and it was pretty quick, but I wanted to make sure we had a lot of time for questions and review. So, what questions do you guys still have, or did you have new questions after um, all the info dumping? I'm gonna try and pull the chat up.
Jane, thank you so much. That is a really terrific and information-packed overview. So I hope that people will chime in with questions, either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask directly. And I'm putting the link to the slides in the chat again so that if people want to take a look at the links that you shared, they can do that.
I have some more resources as well available. There's just a ton of resources in here for you to peruse at your leisure. Um, nobody has had a
Andrew has
question.
a
Hold on.
question.
We have a question. Yay.
So Jane, thanks so much. It was a wonderful presentation. Law is complex, and you did a great job of explaining the context and the kind of the complex role that libraries are in. So I really want to thank you. I just had two questions. One is, are those the slides from that you presented from the Libraries for Trainers? And if so, is it possible for us to use that in workshops or our teaching at the LIS program? Because it's a very succinct, or if it's your own work, I certainly don't want to.
So, no, there's no like set of slides yet for Law for Librarians. It is something that we're working on and hoping to create. These are ones that I created based on the training, but
No need then. So I don't want to impose. So it's
no, no,
great
no. So, but
content. And
I don't mind sharing them.
okay,
And also I'm hoping to work with Law for Librarians to help them create something like that that is more uniform. Because I just don't, I'm happy to share it, but I don't want Law for Librarians to be like, there's this presentation going around and it says L for L on it and we didn't make it.
sure. Well, thanks for the clarification and the permission. So many of us, when we teach in the LIS program, certainly try to acquaint people with many of the laws and the Attorney General's opinion and these kinds of things because it's just so important in terms of being a professional. But one question that I've always wondered since I've come here in Hawaii, but I've never done research on that, is you mentioned about how, like, if a church is using a meeting room, and I've seen this in UH facilities, and compared to other states where I've been, usually public buildings were not made available, that there's the idea of separation of church and state. And I know we have like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but I was just curious in terms of since that's seen, I don't know if that's state rules or if this is a kind of more recent Supreme Court or like other court decision in terms of using, I know, like, for example, some of the public schools are rented out for like church services, and I've always felt like, again, like in government, we can do things in terms of making awareness of religions, but when we're advocating for one, I wonder how that kind of crosses lines and becoming like church and state or the kind of advocacy. And if this is beyond your wheelbarrow, I know your focus is specifically on libraries. Feel free to pass the buck, and I should do some of my own research on that, but just curious.
Brian, do you have something to add here?
I don't necessarily have anything to add other than I did put in there. It's a good question, Andrew. It seems to me, and I didn't come prepared with that question for any legal research, but I seen that treated differently in different jurisdictions. And that's why I think it's an interesting question. Like all things, someone would have to bring a stand, it would have to standing, it would have to definitely bring a suit based on the Constitution. And it seems to me that there hasn't been a clear case. That's why we're kind of in limbo here in Hawaii. But it's a very good question, Andrew.
Yeah, I think it's can vary state to state. I've seen libraries that do have church services use their spaces. I've seen libraries that have it basically written into their room reservation policy that they cannot be used for religious services. Although I would be curious to know if they if that would hold up to a legal challenge or not, because there have been situations where religious institutions have challenged libraries in order to be able to hold services and things there. And I do believe there have been situations where the religious groups have won those challenges. I'm Please take this all with a grain of salt because I can't think of specific cases because the again my no knowledge is very surface level. I remember hearing about that. Um, it would have to be, in my experience, it's typically what is safer is if they can't use the meeting space because of noise concerns or because anybody holding a meeting has to allow access to anyone there, things like that.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions?
I have a question for Gagne or for anybody really. Um, so going back to the topic of, vendors and maintaining your patrons' privacy when kind of vetting the different vendors you use at the library, do you have any recommendations for maybe what to do if there's a particular service or resource that you offer for the patrons that maybe you don't necessarily agree with their privacy practices or their privacy policies, but the service is very popular with your patrons?
Yeah, it can be tough because there aren't there often aren't a lot of alternatives. So if folks want to have this one resource and they'll fight you if you take it away, then that's totally understandable. But what you can do is you can make sure that your library patrons know and understand the practices of that vendor as they're signing up. So on the info page on your library, when it's like, hey, sign up for, you can go here to watch videos online, but please be advised these are the privacy practices of this organization. They don't necessarily reflect the privacy policies of our library, so that they're signing up kind of with their eyes wide open, and then it's up to them whether they consider that risk worth it or not. Did I understand your question properly?
Yes, no, that was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
If there isn't another one, I think it might be interesting for all of us to think about, I was happy that you cited I think it was the Attorney General's opinion in terms of safeguarding, privacy on library materials. And I wonder if HLA might want to try to advocate for getting something that's actually kind of stronger in legal beyond that kind of like an opinion, because that's something sort of like in my mind, an attorney general's opinion is kind of like a presidential act, and so it depends on who's in administration versus something that's kind of statutory law. Is this something that we all might want to consider?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. That's a great point. Um, while we're waiting, I have a question. Um, Jane, you mentioned various examples of public forum. At our library here at UH Manoa, the library administration told us that we had to turn off comments on our social media because if we left it on, that was a public forum and we wouldn't be able to moderate the comments. So we just don't allow them at all. Do you have any comments about that?
So that's a sticky situation that has come up in quite a few of the trainings that I've been to. And generally, yes, if you are a public entity and you have a public social media page and you allow commenting from everyone, it becomes a public forum. Um, there have been situations, there was one recently with, I think, and please, if anybody knows the actual background on this, please stop me and chime in. But I believe some news outlets sued the president because he had blocked them from his social media page. And they're like, no, we're news outlets. We're allowed to have access. Um, so social media is this whole kind of growing new area that's getting a lot of kind of fresh challenges in court. And it's interesting because there's not a lot of case law supporting it. It's growing. But yes, my understanding, typically it's considered a public forum. There are some recommendations that you can have really strict behavior policies that um, give you a little more control over what can and cannot be commented on. But my understanding is, yes, it is a public forum. And if you open up commenting, then you open up commenting and anybody's allowed to comment.
Yeah, thank you. Do other folks have questions? There's so much information was presented and it's all so complicated. Andrew is saying it will be interesting to see how libraries deal with AI use of data from Google Book or other digitization projects. That's pretty challenging beyond
Yeah,
what most of us have to deal with.
AI is interesting. I feel like that's definitely going to be kind of like the social media of the future as we figure these things out. Um, Something else that's been coming up a lot too is protecting your personal information as a government employee. So there was recently a really interesting training through ALA about doxing, which basically is where somebody gets your information and spreads it online. And, perhaps you said something in support of something that a group disagrees with, and then a lot of people send you some very angry emails, etc. Thank you, Brian. Yes. And but basically thinking about law from different angles, right? If you're a government employee and your information is subject to records requests, how do you make sure you're protecting your private information and your private life when part of your life is public like that? And just making sure you're limiting who can view your social media, checking to make sure your passwords haven't been compromised, making sure you have really robust passwords. So really, and robust isn't just hard to guess, it's length. So the strongest passwords are the longer ones because there are a lot of really advanced computer programs now that can just run a random figure generator and guess your 6 character password in a couple days of just like running generators one after the other after the other, because it doesn't even have to be a person behind the keyboard anymore. Um, yes, thank you, Brian. Um, so that's kind of an interesting way to look at privacy as well, is where are we protecting the privacy of our patrons and are we protecting our own privacy?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's one that I think most of us probably haven't even thought about, that if we make some statement in a public forum, that somebody might you know, retaliate against us by doxing or other actions.
Yeah. Actually, while we have Brian, um, I am curious to know if you have the answer to this, Brian. I don't know. I'm still figuring my way around the all of the libraries being one state library, all of the academic libraries being linked the way they are. Who writes the policies for the libraries? Is it one library policy for all the libraries, or is it community individualized based on the community or the location?
Can I ask a follow-up question to that question? Do you mean like here at UH, or do you mean um, which libraries are you referring to? I just want to make sure I understand the scope.
I guess my question is very broad. All of the libraries. So
Sure.
do you, if you happen to know, do all of the state libraries have library policy?
So if you're talking about state law libraries, they they're very They're very insular. They don't have a governing body above them. They're unique. They could be set up in different ways in different states. The only way I see them interact together is when they come to the American Association of Law Libraries and they have a section for state librarians. And Jenny is our state librarian here, Jenny Hilbiger, and I've known once when I was in Minnesota. But my point being, they don't have like a model code or a model rules for those librarians. They can be very, very diverse and different. They just share these ideas when they come together and try to, coordinate that way. That's the best I know about that.
I think,
Or if, oh yeah, sorry.
Jane, all of the public libraries here in Hawaii are all under one set of policies. So the individual
Oh,
libraries,
public.
public
Yes, thank
libraries
you.
do not have any ability to have their own policies. There's just one set of policies for the whole state public library system. The University of Hawaii system, each library has its own policies to some extent, but then some policies are shared, like circulation policies are shared, for example. And if there are state laws or administrative rules that apply to all of the university campuses, of course, those affect the libraries as well. And then the school libraries, again, there's just one statewide school system, so all of the school libraries fall under the laws and regulations that apply to the State Department of Education. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Because I know I talked about having strong policies, but that can be frustrating to hear if you don't have the ability to update your policies, right? So the question becomes, well, what can I do? And I just think a lot of that too is advocating for your patrons joining things like the Hawaii Library Association. I know HLA has an advocacy committee, things like that. And just if you see, don't forget to make, if you see suggestions that can be made, don't be afraid to make them because a lot of times the people who do have the power to update those policies have 100 things going on and they might not see that room for improvement, and then you come in with a suggestion and 9 times out of 10 they're happy to see that suggestion. So don't feel like you don't have the power to make positive changes even if you're not directly involved in creating the policies for your institution.
Hi, everyone. This is Ellen. I'm the president of Hawaii Library Association, and I'm really appreciating this conversation and especially the issue of organizing around these emerging technology issues and the kind of gray areas we're now in. And I think for me, in my scope of understanding how HLA works, yes, we do have a legislative advocacy committee and we do engage with our legislators to help champion bills. But what I think we need is more academic researchers, librarian researchers, archive researchers to help us understand how to craft language around potential legislation for these gray areas. So it needs to be collaborative instead of like having this one small group of people try to figure out the answers for our whole field. And so I think in the future, I think that's something I would propose is like, how do we have a collaborative research agenda to look at what's happening with copyright, to look at what's happening with AI, and how does it affect our profession? And from that research, we can then glean language for policy proposals at the legislature to create potential statutes if it goes through the legislative process successfully.
Yeah, Ellen, thank you for mentioning that. That's certainly important for HLA and other library and archives associations to um, collaborate on making policy changes or changes in the law. We're getting close to time, so are there any final questions? Not seeing anything in the chat. I'm not seeing anybody with their hand up. So I think we'll go ahead and close, but I would like to thank you, Jane, so much, and thank you, Brian, for being the local knowledge expert. And we really appreciate your time in putting this presentation together and all the resources that you shared. So mahalo.
Thank you, everybody. If you have a chance, please feel free to fill out this survey. And I appreciate your time.